Hi everyone. Today we're talking about something that I think is one of the most consequential pieces in stress science, and most people have never encountered it. So it's about stress cycle, what it is, why it needs to be closed, and what happens to your body and your nervous system when it doesn't. And we're going to start by looking at the animal kingdom, a bit of a surprise. Robert Sapolsky, a neuroendocrinologist at Stanford, is one of the most prominent voices in stress research in the last 50 years. Described a scene in his book that's called "Why Zebras Don't Have Ulcers." So a zebra has been chased by a lion, and for a few terrifying minutes, every single system in its body mobilizes towards one goal: survival. Cortisol and adrenaline flood the bloodstream, the heart rate surges, muscles receive a massive influx of glucose, and digestion shuts down. So the entire physiology reorganizes itself around the question of whether it will live or die. And then, after the zebra escapes, it trembles. It shakes from head to hoof. And then it gradually slows, the breathing deepens, and within minutes, it's back to grazing, physiologically returning to the baseline. And it's like the chase had never happened. That trembling isn't a side effect of a chase, it's a completion of a stress cycle. The body is building mechanism for discharge of the stress and all the chemical changes in the body, signaling that it is safe to return to rest. It is, in a very literal sense, the body finishing what it started. And here's the part that matters the most for us humans. We have exactly the same wiring. We simply stop using it and get stuck in the activated fight or flight mode as a response to a stressor for a longer period of times. And that's mentally and physically damaging. To understand why this matters so much, it helps us to understand what the stress response is and what it is designed to do. Because in its original context, it's a marvel of biological engineering. So when your brain receives a threat, and I want to emphasize that it can be anything, it can be a predator, it can be a heated confrontation with a colleague or a partner, it's a difficult email or a deadline or a conversation that you're afraid to have. Basically, a cascade of events is set in motion. So the axis that's called hypothalamic pituitary adrenaline axis, HPA in short, activates. It causes the cortisol release, and simultaneously the sympathetic nervous system that is responsible for the responding to stress or activating nervous system triggers a release of adrenaline and noradrenaline. So your heart rate rises, your blood pressure increases, and the digestion is suppressed. Your senses sharpen, and the massive amount of glucose is released into your bloodstream to fuel your muscles. Basically, for one person to help you respond to an immediate, time limited physical threat. And the response is fight or flight. And the key phrase here is time limited. Sapolsky's decade of research showed that the stress response is adaptive precisely because it's designed to be temporary. It's meant to activate, do its work, and then resolve. And any animal mobilizes, escapes, or fights, and then completes the cycle, stress cycle, and returns back to the calm state, to the equilibrium. And the our problem, our human problem, is what happens when that resolution, the calm, never comes. Researchers Bruce McEwen and Elliot Steller published a paper that introduced a concept that I think everyone should know about. It's called allostatic load. They defined it as a cumulative physiological cost of chronic stress exposure, something that we all have in the modern life. The biological wear and tear that accumulates when the body is repeatedly activated without adequate recovery. McEwan spent decades mapping exactly what the accumulated cost looks like in the body. And bottom line is that chronic cortisol elevation suppresses immune function. It makes us more vulnerable to illnesses, disrupts the brain region that's called hippocampus, that's involved in memory and learning, and that's particularly sensitive to prolonged exposure to stress hormones. This regulates sleep, increases cardiovascular risks, impairs metabolic function. So, those are pretty grave results of being exposed to stress in the chronically. And the crucial distinction McEwan drew, and that's what I'm trying to accent here. Um, that's like the heart of what we're talking about today is between stress that is acute and recoverable, like temporary stress, and stress that is chronic and cumulative. So the acute and recoverable stress is not a problem. Uh, it's the chronic one that becomes a problem just because we don't close the stress cycle. Modern professional life tends to produce chronic stress. We face them the stressors, they're not time limited encounters, and they're not physical danger that resolves and done. They are ongoing, overlapping, frequently unresolved. Just think of a difficult day at work. And the nervous system, which evolved to handle the acute stress, is simply not equipped to regulate the chronic stress without a deliberate support. So, what it means in practice is that your body may still be carrying cortisol load from Monday's difficult conversation when Wednesday's deadline arrives. The stress response was activated but never completed. The stress cycle was not completed. And all the mobilized energy, it was never discharged. And according to the allostatic load model, that biological residue didn't just disappear, it accumulated in your body, in your tissues, over days, weeks, and years. And this brings me to what I think is the single most important and overlooked distinction in all the stress research. Resolving stressor and completing the stress cycle are not the same thing. So, managing stress in the moment, taking a deep breath, not trying not to get like too overheated, um, and releasing the cortisol, like helping your body to release the reaction to stress, the physiological reaction to stress, are not the same thing. Emily and Amelia Nagoski articulate this beautifully in their book that's called Burnout, drawing on the broader stress psychology literature. Your brain requires a physiological signal that the threat is genuinely over. Cognitively, knowing that the situation has passed, telling yourself it's fine, it's done, there is nothing more to worry about, is not sufficient because nervous system does not operate on cognitive information. It operates on physiological signals. And the completion of stress cycle requires a somatic, a body response, something that the body communicates in the language the nervous system speaks, that is safe to return to rest. For the zebra that I mentioned before, the signal was trembling and shaking. It's a full body discharge of residual mobilized energy. For us, the research points that there are several equivalent mechanisms that we can use, and I want to walk you through each one of them because I think it matters to understand not just what works, but why it works. So, the most extensively researched pathway is movement, especially sustained aerobic exercise. A major review that was published in Frontiers in Psychiatry in 2015 found that acute aerobic exercise reliably reduces the HPA axis, the fight or flight response axis reactivity, and accelerates cortisol recovery following the psychological stressors. The mechanisms appear to involve both direct metabolic clearance of stress hormone, meaning like removing cortisol from the body, and upregulation of neural pathways that facilitate parasympathetic recovery. So, regulation of nervous system. It can be easy jogging, it can be swimming, cycling. I would like to add stretching here. Any sustained aerobic activity essentially mimics the biological completion that evolutionary would have followed the physical act of escaping a threat. You mobilize, you move, you discharged, and the cycle closes. The second pathway is breath, specifically extended exhalation. Research published in Frontiers of Human Neuroscience in 2018 reviewed the evidence of slow paced breathing as a tool to enhance the heart rate variability, which is itself one of the most reliable markers for parasympathetic regulation. Parasympathetic is the nervous system part of the nervous system, sorry, that is responsible for recovery from the stress reaction and relaxation. So, what appears to be particularly effective is extending the exhalation and it to be longer than inhalation, inhaling for, let's say, 4 counts and exhaling for 6 to 8 to 12, whatever you're capable of, that activates the vagal brake nervous brake of the vagus nerve and directly downregulates sympathetic activation. This is incidentally the long, slow exhale that you spontaneously produce when you finally sit down after a long day, like a sigh. You all recognize it. Your body already knows how to do that. You do it. You just don't think what's happening. Um, and the practice is simply to make it intentional. Third pathway, and this is the one that brings us back to zebra, is actually therapeutic trembling and shaking. Um, David Berchelli's tension and trauma release exercises were developed specifically to elicit the natural tremor response that many humans have learned to suppress. Peter Levine's work on somatic experiences similarly documents the body's instinctive response to threat completion, the shaking, the stretching, the spontaneous movements, um, as serving to genuine psychological regulatory function. That's the same mechanism that Sapolsky observed in zebras and formalized it into clinical practice. The fourth pathway is social connection and co regulation. Research published in Biological Psychiatry in 2003 demonstrates that social support significantly attenuates cortisol responses to stressors. With physical contact, the release of oxytocin through the touch playing a particularly important role. Think about a hug. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory offers the neurological framework for understanding why. The ventral vagal system, which mediates social engagement, is neurologically incompatible with sustained threat activation. Being in presence of someone you feel safe with is not just emotionally comforting, it's also physiologically regulatory. And then there are less obvious but equally documented pathways, such as crying, laughing, and creative expression. Research on emotional tears has found that crying activates parasympathetic nervous system and is associated with measurable reduction in stress hormones. We're talking about cortisol. Laughter has been shown to affect cortisol and neuroendocrine regulation in similar ways. And these are not soft adds on, they are very precise in the biological sense and legitimate mechanisms for completing um, what the stress response has started. So watching maybe funny reels is sometimes not only a screen time but it's therapeutic. It's the intention behind it. So, what does it all mean for how we actually live our lives? what the research collectively suggests is that stress itself is not a primary problem. It is the uncompleted stress that accumulates into allostatic load. And the practical implication of the distinction are enormous. Many strategies that high functioning professionals rely on to manage stress, cognitive reframing, compartmentalization, discipline, time management, operate at the level of a stressor. They may reduce the frequency and intensity of stress activation, but that is genuinely useful, of course, but they do not on their own ensure that the stress cycle that do occur are properly closed. The result is what McEden's research describes as a chronic low level activation that characterizes so much of the modern professional life. A nervous system that is never fully in threat mode, but also never fully at rest, cycling through the partial activation and never quite resolves it. Completing the stress cycle requires deliberate daily practice, and evidence suggests that the specific form matters less than the consistency. Movement, breath, shaking, physical contact, creative expression, connection. These are not wellness extras. To be added one time allows it actually the mechanisms that uh, show your nervous system to that it's safe to go back into the natural resting state, and without them it simply doesn't get there on its own. I want to leave you with this, something that I find particularly important about this research and about this topic generally: the way it inverts the usual hierarchy we place between thinking and moving. We tend to treat physical practices as a secondary to cognitive ones. We run after work as a reward. When we have time, we stretch as something that whenever we think about it, basically, the long exhales, they are happening as a reflex rather than the deliberate practice of self-regulation. But the neuroscience of stress suggests that it actually quite the opposite. Physiological language of safety is body first, somatic first, and that nervous system requires embodied signals to of completion before it can generally shift the state from the activated to the resting, from the stress response to the calm and safety. And the zebra does not think its way out of the cortisol load. It shakes, and the body knows what's exactly to do. And we have the same capacity. And this is the invitation, which is also the practice, simply to remember that it's there, and we can use it. Thank you for spending this time with me today. And if this episode resonates with you, I'd like to hear what your stress cycle completion practice looks like, and how often do you do that, and what are you thinking of trying if you're not doing it yet. Um, if you're curious to know more about what you can actually build in somatic practices, and how you can regulate your nervous system, how you can build a literacy and create a structure around supporting your mental health. Um, Connect with me and follow me on Instagram and check out my website. I hope you find it useful. Thank you very much. And I see you next time. And take good care of your body because it's carrying more than you realize.